Hello, I'm Michał Kolanko. I'm a journalist working for Rzeczpospolitej daily newspaper. It's my great pleasure to introduce my guest, Gaia Vince, award-winning science writer and author, Anthropocene researcher. Welcome.
Hi, Michal. It's so a pleasure to be here with you.
So our conversation obviously takes place during Impact conference in Poznań, a very big and eventful, let's say, conference. So I would like to start by not by questions about your book, a new book, but something I found here on your website, because you said that you are particularly interested in interaction between human systems and Earth's planetary systems. So
that's what drives all my research.
Yeah.
Really.
So what does it mean? So what does it mean, these interactions between systems? If you could explain that.
Yeah, so it's a different perspective, I suppose, of looking at where we are in space and time. If we look at the planet Earth as it's spinning, it's the only living planet in the universe. And when I say living planet, I mean the Earth's biology, its chemistry, its physics, all of these interact. So the biology of the Earth, the photosynthetic plants that have arisen and algae, the animals that then evolve to eat those, all of those interact in this system to create the climate, to create the water, the hydrology. And then along came this incredible kind of ape, our human ancestors.
It was a game changer of sorts, right?
Absolutely. We changed that, and we changed it in different ways, but one of the most important ways that we changed this is, for the first time, a creature had the ability to harness a source of energy outside of itself. So instead of just getting its energy from its food or from the sun, eating the sun as photosynthetic plants do, it got its energy externally by burning stuff. And so we burnt trees, forests, all of that. And then in the Industrial Revolution, we began burning fossil forests. And that's what really changed our climate.
Now we can quickly shift to your book, Nomad Century, which was released in Poland just recently. So
in a beautiful yellow edition.
Yeah, that's right.
So lovely.
You can all see it here. It's a book about migration. This is, I think, the best way to put it. And what specifically you are talking about in this book?
Yeah, so as we were talking about the human systems interacting with the planetary systems, what's happened is our human systems have now become dominant. It's us that decide the temperature of the atmosphere or the oceans. It's us that decide whether a plant lives or dies or an animal species goes extinct. But with that, we have changed the temperature. We are now living in this post-climate change world. Like, we should be moving into an ice age. That's where the planetary systems should be going, but instead we are heating the planet. Last year we had the first year of 1.5 degrees on average above the pre-industrial average. And what's happening as we increase that temperature of the atmosphere is we are increasing the unlivability, the band at which humans have adapted their culture and their civilizations to exist over the last few thousand years is now getting smaller and shifting north. So we're going to see over the coming decades this increasing band of unlivability in tropical regions because of extreme events like what I call the four horsemen of the Anthropocene: fire, floods, drought and heat, which drive people to leave their homes.
So do you think it's irrevocable?
Well,
at this moment?
You know, we do have a lot of options. So we are already increasing the temperature. We are likely to see somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees above the pre-industrial average by the end of the century. We can mitigate, we can decarbonate much faster, and so perhaps not reach those temperatures, but that climate change is going to increase. We do have artificial ways of cooling the temperature in the same way that volcanoes do, by geoengineering our atmosphere to increase the reflectivity, and that would artificially cool the temperature of the Earth. But without that, no, the temperature is going to rise. It's already rising. We're already seeing enormous numbers of climate migrants in their tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions, but at the moment they're all within nations. So they appear kind of invisible to most of us.
So what are strategies countries can implement to mitigate this coming wave, let's say?
Right, so we have lots and lots of options, both in terms of adapting places that are in more dangerous latitudes by moving people from at-risk zones near coastal erosion or that are dangerous, adapting agriculture, because the places where people currently grow food are going to become, those types of food are not going to be able to grow there. But we can also talk about that very natural thing that humans have always done in 200,000 years, which is human mobility around the globe has always been going on. It will be driven slightly more by climate change. We need to understand that. We need to stop demonizing it, but we can also capitalize on it. We can use this as a huge opportunity to grow cities and their economic productivity, which is something we absolutely need to start talking about as the demographic crisis hits.
This is a very interesting topic, because I think that the current conversation about climate change and migration, all the dangers we've talked about, is a very kind of doom and gloom scenarios. Obviously, these are great challenges, but what you said about cities, it's interesting that you have to obviously cope with these problems, but also find solutions which are not just to get a wall everywhere, right?
Absolutely. So my book is a book of solutions. These are the things that we can do, and we have many, many options. Cities thrive on immigration. They are entirely built on immigration. Most people, or a large number of the people living in cities, are actually themselves migrants from rural areas, or their parents certainly were. We're going to increasingly see that happening across borders. We're going to see people who are, for example, in Poland, who speak Polish with foreign accents because they were born somewhere else. Just as a few decades ago, people from Vietnam or people from Cuba came to Poland and they're now Polish citizens. So we need to expand that idea, but we also need to recognize that in this coming decades where we're going to see terrible impacts of climate change, we are also going to see some winners. And Poland, even though it faces terrible climate impacts from increased drought, terrible heat waves, is also going to be a winner in climate change.
But you have to have political leadership adapting to the situation, so you don't just drift, right?
Michal, you have hit the nail on the head. We need political leadership. We have had very poor leadership globally around these issues, actually, around climate change and around human mobility. We really need, first of all, we need city mayors, then we need national leaders, then we need bipartisan and regional agreements, and we also need right at the top, this is a global problem, it's a planetary problem, we need leadership from a new UN body that will actually, that has teeth to actually do something about it. And that is the crux of why we haven't dealt with the climate crisis and why we're in such a mess in terms of many of our economies are static. We need migration to work, and that does take leadership. We need them to step up.
By the way, do you believe in large-scale geoengineering solutions to fight climate change? Is it for you something real or just science fiction?
Well, I mean, the technology, we know how it works. It's not complicated at all how it works. These sulfates, for example, reflect back the sun's heat. We see it with volcanoes. We know how it works. Whether it's feasible to do it, we haven't had the experiments. And one of the reasons is because it's taboo. People are not even talking about it. They're not discussing this in a pragmatic way. They're not discussing any of these issues in a pragmatic way. We need to decide. We need to talk about this in democratic countries so that we can decide whether we want to do it. I think what will happen is that the impacts of climate change will become so severe and cause so many deaths that we will get the unilateral deployment of these technologies by an individual state or even an actor who is wealthy enough, a tech billionaire who is wealthy enough to deploy it. And that's not the way that we should do any of these globally impacting technologies. You know, we need to discuss either we rule it out Okay, so we've made a decision. Or we use it, but under what circumstances? When do we stop it? Who decides? Where do we do it? How do we compensate people who have negative impacts from the technology? We can't make any of these decisions if we're not even having the conversation.
Yeah, getting back to impacts, I think the thesis during this edition of Impact is that, well, the globalization is ending. And this was the thesis of the first keynote. And I think the question is whether whether climate change will make globalization needed, just to have a global response to it, as we've talked before.
Well, I would disagree that globalization is ended. I think we are a very globalized world, and that is continuing. It may be taking different forms, and there may be new types of conflict and new types of economic systems coming into play, and different parts of the world are becoming more dominant in our globalization, but globalization is very much with us to stay. Everything you have, everything you eat, everything that you use has come about as a cooperative enterprise between multiple different countries, different populations and people in so many different countries all coming together to produce something. They don't know you, they don't know how you're using it, they don't know each other, and yet we have managed to cooperate internationally to do this. It's here to stay. We need to use it and guide it in far more beneficial ways than we have at the moment.
So obviously, Nomad Century is your latest book, but before that, there was Transcendence and the Anthropocene. And so I wonder, what is adventures in the Anthropocene? So what does it mean, adventures?
Well, so I went on a 2.5-year journey around the world, mainly around the global south, to explore where we were as a human population at the beginning of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene really is this human-dominated era where humans decide how and where a river flows. You know, they create entirely artificial landscapes like cities or farmland. The temperature of the atmosphere is down to us, extinctions are down to us, all of this. And I was interested in looking at some of the people who were right at the forefront of these planetary changes and seeing how they were impacted and what it was doing to their lives and how they were changing because of it. And through that, I discovered that people really were taking, they were finding their own solutions. They weren't waiting for, somebody in the West at a university to come up with a solution and then that be handed to them. People everywhere from small Indonesian islands and small island states to farmers in India to agricultural workers in the Andes. They were all coming up with their own types of solution to the changes that are going on in the planet. And so I wrote that up.
So we've talked about solutions before, but one thing I think is important here, that if we design solutions on a bigger scale, like for example the European Green Deal, it kind of sometimes backfires. And now the European discussion about this Green Deal is kind of I think maybe not collapsing, but clearly there are signs that some policies weren't properly implemented, and now the European Union has to backtrack on these issues. Do you?
Well, I would say that it doesn't have to backtrack, and it's true. When we are in unprecedented, uncharted territory, we are facing dramatic changes, and we have to act much faster than any time in our past to transition from our energy systems. We went from wood to coal, we went from coal to gas, we went from gas to oil, and at each transition took decades, took generations. It was slow, it was difficult, there were winners and losers. We are now trying to transition our energy system away from combustion altogether. That's a really profound change, and we're trying to do it in a very short period of time. And we're trying to do it with huge industrialized populations with their own agendas, and it's difficult. So We need to do it much faster. We need to be bolder, absolutely, but we need to bring people on board, and that takes far greater commitment and diplomacy and a lot less of the pandering to certain industries and lobbyists.
Yeah, I think that the discussion about transformation in Europe, especially in European Union, and in Poland as well, it's like discussion that it has to be not only smart and efficient, but also just. So the people who are in the middle class just don't see it as a tool for the wealthiest. So they don't. So the wealthiest don't have to pay for anything, but the middle class and the lower classes, they just have to pay for everything during this transformation. I think this is a very crucial thing for this whole project to work.
Yes, and I think what that takes, even though people don't want to hear it, is bigger government. We need bigger government. This transition is not something that can be driven and guided by the markets, by business, by little tweaks to regulations. It takes big government, and every single energy transition to date has also taken big government. They have to guide policy, but they also have to produce a much bigger public subsidy program to make sure that people can maintain their livelihoods at the same time as this transition. Now, we saw bigger government during the COVID emergency, where government stepped up to fund vaccination, to fund loss of livelihood when people had to stay at home, all sorts of things like that to maintain industry. This is a much bigger emergency, and it requires a lot more funding and strategic thinking, and there is little evidence of that. I think the United States IRA Act, that was an example of clever policy making.
Yeah, I think some people in Brussels, they now just think that, well, we should do this like the American way, not our way. I have this feeling that this policy you've talked about is very smart and efficient, probably.
I think it definitely requires bigger government. That's what is needed, and that's what's absent at the moment. And it requires courage, and it requires taking people on board with what we don't hear enough about the positives of this. Even if there was no climate change, right? Transitioning our energy supplies and doing it fast, and it also requires a massive overhaul of our food systems, by the way, but transitioning our energy supplies is good for health, right? Because this is very dangerous, these pollutions. They kill, tens of millions every year are killed by poor air quality, but also global security. Look what happens when Russia invades Ukraine, right? If we had decentralized energy coming from renewables, where's the power that Russia has there? Okay, it takes away that power, but it's not just that. Our geopolitics is entirely built around these relationships we have propping up the accident of where geology has put fuels. Once we don't need fuels, once that infrastructure is in place, you don't need to keep refueling it. The sun will keep shining, the wind will keep blowing. Geothermal, which is hardly used at all at the moment, is going to keep supplying that energy from the earth. It frees us from damaging relationships, and it allows states, it allows leaders to work democratically for their own citizens.
So just one final question. I wonder what motivates you, what drives you in your work, because you've mentioned this 2-year journey. Obviously, it sounds, some people would say it's great to travel for 2 years, but it's kind of, but I think it requires a lot of drive and motivation. So I wonder what motivates you in this.
So I'm driven by curiosity about ourselves and our time, and I think this is a really unique time in human history, but also in global history, and how these Earth systems that we just evolved into have been totally changed by us, and how that threatens our own survival is, to me, one of the biggest questions. So I'm driven by that, and I'm also driven by that need to produce a better Anthropocene, a better future. Right now we have pollution, we have poverty, we have high food and energy prices, we have all sorts of problems in our world, we can produce a better world.
Let's end on this optimistic note. Thank you very much. I'm Michał Kolanko, and my guest today was Gaia Vince, author of book Nomad Century and other books, obviously. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks.